The cold air of the early morning clung to the city as she walked toward the tall glass building, her cleaning bag heavy in her hand. It was her usual time, earlier than most employees arrived, because she liked to finish her first round before the noise of the day began. As she pushed open the big glass doors, she noticed him immediately. The CEO was sitting in the lobby, something unusual in itself. He was always busy, always rushing somewhere, not the type to sit idly where people could see him. His coffee cup was in one hand, but the cup wobbled slightly, the liquid trembling at the rim. She paused mid-step. His skin looked paler than she remembered, the healthy tan replaced by a faint gray tone. His eyes, usually sharp and bright, seemed heavy, as though the light behind them was dimming. She kept walking toward the elevators, but her gaze stayed on him. He noticed and smiled faintly, the kind of smile people give when they're pretending everything is fine. She nodded back, deciding not to say anything yet. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe it was none of her business. But the picture of his trembling hand stayed in her mind. She had seen that before. Years ago, when her uncle had felt strange but insisted on going to work. He didn't make it home that day without help. The lobby was quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioner. A security guard at the desk scrolled through his phone, glancing at the CEO once before returning to whatever video he was watching. People passed through the doors, some greeting the CEO politely, others too lost in their own morning rush to notice him at all. No one seemed to see what she saw. She stepped into the elevator, but even as the doors closed, she caught one last glimpse of him shifting in his seat, his posture slightly slouched, like he was trying to keep himself upright. On the upper floor, she began her work, wiping down desks, emptying bins, and spraying the windows until they shone. But her mind kept drifting back to the lobby. She told herself she was overthinking it. A man like him probably worked late into the night, barely slept, and survived on coffee. Still, there was something about his movements, that faint hesitation when he raised the cup to his lips, that made her uneasy. She moved faster, wanting to finish her round so she could head downstairs again. Half an hour later, she returned to the lobby with her supplies. The CEO was still there, now leaning slightly to one side, his phone in his right hand. He tapped at the screen slowly, almost too slowly for someone known for lightning-fast replies. She walked past him, pretending to be focused on polishing a nearby table, but she kept him in her peripheral vision. He didn't look up, but she noticed his breathing, steady yet heavier than it should have been for someone just sitting still. A group of employees entered, laughing about something, and one of them clapped the CEO on the shoulder in greeting. He smiled again, gave a short reply, and lowered his eyes to his phone. The interaction was so brief that no one noticed the way his fingers fumbled on the device afterward. Her grip tightened on the cloth in her hand. The memory of her uncle's first symptoms replayed like a warning in her head. She had ignored it back then until it was too late. She moved to the reception counter to empty the small trash bin. The security guard glanced at her, then at the CEO, then went back to scrolling his phone. She wondered if she should say something, but what would she even say? She was just the cleaner. People often overlooked her, spoke around her as if she wasn't there. The CEO probably had a whole medical team he could call if something was wrong. But still, he hadn't moved from that chair in almost an hour. When she finished tidying the lobby area, she decided to walk past him one more time. As she passed, she caught a closer look at his hand gripping the cup. The tremor was still there, faint but steady, and his knuckles looked tense. For a second, their eyes met. His smile returned, but it was weaker now, and there was a shadow behind it, almost like relief that someone had noticed. She wanted to ask if he was okay, but her voice caught in her throat. Instead, she gave a polite nod and moved on, her heart beating faster for reasons she couldn't explain. The elevator doors opened again behind her, and more employees entered the lobby. The CEO straightened in his chair, forcing himself to look composed as people walked past. She could see the effort in the way he adjusted his tie, the way he lifted his chin. To them, he looked like the same confident leader they admired. To her, he looked like a man trying to hide that something inside him wasn't right. By the time she returned to the upper floors, the morning sun was streaming through the wide office windows, casting long shadows on the carpet. She worked in silence, the sound of her cleaning tools and the distant ringing of phones filling the air. Yet every movement she made felt automatic. Her mind was in the lobby, Isaac watching him again and again, seeing the tremor, the pale skin, the heavy eyes. She couldn't shake the unease curling in her stomach. She told herself that maybe she was imagining it, that she had no right to interfere in his business. But deep down, a small voice whispered that she might be the only one who had noticed, and if she ignored that voice, she might regret it for the rest of her life. While cleaning the long glass table in the meeting room, she heard the CEO's voice coming from the other side of the room. He was talking to his assistant, but his words sounded different, slightly heavy, almost as if his tongue was struggling to keep up. She froze for a second, her cloth mid-wipe, and listened more closely. The assistant didn't seem to notice anything unusual. They were talking about schedules, meetings, and calls. But every now and then, there was a small pause before the CEO spoke again, as if he was trying to find the right words. She bent lower, pretending to polish a chair, but her eyes watched him carefully. He stood up from his seat to reach for a file, and that was when she noticed it. He grabbed the edge of the table for support. His fingers gripped it tightly, and his movement was slower than it should have been. The assistant laughed about something, and the CEO gave a short chuckle too, but there was a flicker of strain in his face. People began to enter the meeting room, filling it with chatter and the sound of chairs scraping against the floor. She moved to one side, quietly collecting empty cups from the coffee corner, still watching him from the corner of her eye. No one else noticed that he was leaning slightly on his right side when he stood. His left arm rested stiffly against his body. It didn't swing naturally when he moved. She knew that wasn't normal. One of the junior staff made a joke, and the CEO smiled politely, but there was no warmth in it. His face seemed tight, and a bead of sweat formed on his forehead, even though the room was cool. She saw him rub his temple for a second, then quickly lower his hand, trying not to draw attention. Everyone else was too busy shuffling papers and preparing for the meeting. Her mind flashed back again to her uncle. She could still remember the day he had been sitting at their kitchen table, holding a cup of tea in the same awkward way. He had complained of feeling off, but brushed it aside, saying he was just tired. Hours later, he was in the hospital. She had been younger then, unsure of what to do. This time felt too similar to ignore. She left the meeting room for a moment to empty the bin, her thoughts turning over quickly. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe it was nothing. But her stomach wouldn't settle. She took the trash bag to the service area and came back with a fresh one. When she returned, the CEO was seated again, flipping through a stack of papers. But his grip on the pen looked awkward, almost like his fingers weren't moving as they should. She pretended to fix a chair near him, close enough to see his face clearly. There was a faint droop on one side of his mouth, so small most people wouldn't notice. But she did. She wanted to say something right there, but the room was full. People might laugh at her, or worse, tell her to leave. When the meeting started, she stepped back to the corner of the room to dust the window blinds. The CEO began speaking, but his voice faltered slightly before he continued. The assistant leaned forward to take notes, not reacting to the change. Her hands worked automatically as she cleaned, but her ears caught every word, every hesitation. She knew enough from experience to understand that something was happening to him, even if he didn't see it himself. A few minutes later, he reached for a glass of water. His hand trembled slightly as he lifted it, and some of the water spilled onto the table. He gave a quick, embarrassed smile, and someone joked about needing more coffee to wake up. The laughter in the room made her chest tighten. They thought it was nothing, but she could see the truth in the small details. The way he quickly set the glass down, the way his shoulders stiffened, the way his left hand remained motionless in his lap. She finished her cleaning in the room, but before leaving, she looked at him once more. He was listening to someone talk. His eyes fixed on the person, but they seemed less focused now. She saw his jaw shift slowly as if chewing invisible words, and that strange stillness in his left arm didn't change. When she walked out into the hallway, the noise of the meeting room fading behind her, her mind was unsettled. She had been working in that building for years, and she had seen the CEO in all moods, angry, cheerful, stressed, and calm. This was different. This was the quiet kind of wrong that didn't shout for attention but whispered for help. She pushed her cleaning cart down the hall, her thoughts circling. No one else would step in. They didn't see what she saw, or maybe they didn't want to. People often ignored the cleaner in the corner of the room, assuming she didn't hear, didn't notice, didn't understand. But she noticed everything. She decided she needed to watch him more closely. If the signs grew worse, she would have to speak up, no matter what people thought. Her uncle's voice rang in her memory, the way he had told her from his hospital bed, "Don't ever ignore the signs." She wasn't going to make that mistake again, even if it meant risking her job. By noon, the office had settled into its usual midday rhythm. Phones rang, keyboards clicked, and the smell of food drifted in from the break room. The CEO's door was open, but he remained at his desk, flipping through documents without much energy. She passed by while pushing her cleaning cart, noticing he hadn't moved for a long time. His lunch tray sat untouched on the side table, steam long gone from the soup, the bread still wrapped. He didn't even look at it. The secretary walked in with a glass of water, placing it beside him. "You should drink," she said lightly, but he only gave a small nod without reaching for it. His focus seemed far away, as if he was forcing himself to work. When the secretary left, he shifted in his chair, his left arm resting strangely flat on the desk. The movement looked unnatural, as though the arm had no energy to lift on its own. She slowed her steps, pretending to arrange some magazines on a nearby table. From that spot, she could see his face clearly. There was a faint tightness in his jaw, and his eyes blinked a little slower than before. The pen in his right hand moved over the paper, but it wasn't steady. Each stroke seemed deliberate, careful, as if he was making sure the letters came out right. Employees came in and out of his office with reports, greeting him quickly and leaving just as fast. No one stayed long enough to notice the subtle changes in his posture or the weakness in his movements. She noticed everything. Even from the hallway earlier, she had caught sight of him leaning heavily on the desk just to stand up and greet a client. When she entered again to collect the trash, the CEO looked up and gave her a faint smile. It was polite, but tired. The left corner of his mouth didn't rise as much as the right. She felt her stomach tighten. The image of her uncle in the early stages of his stroke flashed in her mind, how one side of his face had started to droop without anyone paying attention. She looked at the CEO's arm again. It still hadn't moved. She bent down to pick up a crumpled piece of paper from the floor, all the while glancing at his legs. One foot was tapping lightly, but the other remained perfectly still. The signs were building, and she knew they weren't just from exhaustion. She remembered reading somewhere that strokes could creep in quietly, giving only small warnings before striking hard. The hum of the air conditioner filled the room. Papers rustled. He reached for the glass of water at last, but even that movement seemed heavy. The glass wobbled slightly in his grasp, and he took only a small sip before setting it back down. She wanted to speak, but the secretary was back, talking about schedules. The CEO answered, his voice slightly lower now, and she noticed that some words didn't come out as crisp as before. The secretary didn't seem to notice and left again. Silence returned. She worked slowly, wiping the side tables, taking her time so she could observe. His right hand rubbed his temple briefly, and then he shook his head as if to clear it. The papers before him blurred in his vision. She could tell from the way he leaned closer to read them. He let out a slow breath, his shoulders rising and falling. She thought about the way people always assumed someone else would step in if something was wrong. In her experience, that someone else rarely existed. People were too wrapped in their own tasks, too focused on deadlines to notice the small signs of trouble in others. And in this building, no one would expect the cleaner to be the one paying attention. The CEO glanced toward the window, his eyes unfocused for a moment. She followed his gaze and saw nothing outside but the bright city skyline. Then his attention shifted back to the papers, though his pen had stopped moving. She recognized that look. It was the same one her uncle had before he couldn't speak at all. Her heart beat faster. The signs were getting stronger, but still no one noticed. She asked herself if she should call someone right away, but a small voice inside told her to watch a little longer to be sure. She knew this was dangerous thinking. Every minute could matter, yet she also knew that if she rushed in without proof, she might be dismissed as overreacting. She finished tidying up, but instead of leaving, she stood at the door for a moment, pretending to check the trash bag. The CEO didn't notice her. His head was bent low over the desk, his right hand still holding the pen loosely, the left arm lying unmoved. He looked smaller somehow, as if the energy that usually filled the room when he was present had dimmed. As she stepped out into the hallway, her chest felt tight. She could hear laughter from the break room, people chatting about weekend plans, and the clicking of heels on the marble floor. Life in the building moved on as usual, completely unaware that behind that open office door, something serious might be unfolding. She pushed her cart down the corridor, but her mind was still in his office. The image of his still arm and the faint droop in his smile replayed again and again. She knew that the moment might be coming soon when she would have to act, whether or not anyone believed her. While cleaning his office later that afternoon, she noticed him trying to stand from his chair. At first, it seemed like a simple movement, but he pushed himself up slowly, his hands gripping the armrests for support. His right leg moved forward, but his left leg dragged slightly, just enough for her to notice. He gave a short laugh, the kind people use to hide discomfort, and said he hadn't slept well. His voice was calm, but there was a slight slur in the way he formed his words. She stopped wiping the desk and stepped a little closer. "Are you feeling numbness in your arm?" she asked softly, almost in a whisper. His eyes flicked to hers, and for a second she saw surprise, almost as if he hadn't expected anyone to notice. Then his gaze dropped, and he nodded faintly, barely moving his head, as though admitting it made the truth too real. That was the moment her worry turned into urgency. She thought about her uncle again, how those same symptoms had been ignored until it was too late. Her fingers tightened around the cloth in her hand. She knew exactly what this could mean. Every second mattered now. He tried to wave it off, insisting it was just fatigue, but she could see the way his left shoulder sagged slightly lower than the right. She had been quiet all morning, observing, doubting herself, but now there was no space left for hesitation. "You need a doctor right now," she said firmly, her voice still respectful but edged with determination. The CEO chuckled lightly, as if the idea of needing medical attention was absurd. "I'm fine," he replied. "I've got a meeting in 20 minutes. That's more important right now." She shook her head. "No meeting is more important than your life." Her tone made him pause, the seriousness cutting through his dismissal. But just then his assistant walked in, holding a folder, and glanced between them. The assistant gave her a polite but puzzled look, then told the CEO they still had several points to review before the meeting. She took a deep breath and spoke before he could reply. "I think he's showing signs of a stroke," she said, her voice steady but urgent. The assistant frowned, clearly unsure how to respond. The CEO tried to laugh it off again, saying she was exaggerating, but when he reached for the pen on his desk, his fingers missed it the first time. That small action silenced the room for a moment. "I'm serious," she continued, stepping forward slightly. "My uncle had the same signs: slurred speech, weak arm, trouble standing. If you wait, it could get worse fast." The assistant looked at the CEO more closely now, noticing his uneven posture and the way he was holding his left arm still. "Maybe we should," the assistant began, but the CEO interrupted, saying they didn't have time for unnecessary drama. Her voice rose just enough to break through the tension. "Please, you can't see what I'm seeing, but I know this is not nothing. You need help now, not later." There was a beat of silence before the CEO sighed, clearly torn between brushing her off and listening. His pride seemed to be holding him back from admitting weakness. She didn't move, didn't look away. Her eyes stayed on him, steady and firm. The assistant finally reached for the phone. "Let's just get the company nurse up here to check," the assistant suggested, but she shook her head quickly. "No, call an ambulance. Don't waste time." The CEO looked at her with a strange expression, half irritation, half curiosity. People didn't usually speak to him like this. He was used to people agreeing with him, not challenging him, but something in her tone made him stop arguing. Maybe it was the memory of the way her voice didn't waver, or maybe it was because deep down he knew something was wrong. The assistant hesitated for only a second before dialing emergency services. She stood there, her heart pounding, watching as the CEO sat back in his chair. His left hand slid slowly from the desk into his lap, limp. He didn't even notice. That sight made her chest tighten. She stayed nearby, not caring if anyone thought it was strange for the cleaner to stand guard over the CEO. She had no medical degree, no official authority, but in that moment, she knew she was the only one in the room who truly understood how urgent this was. When the assistant hung up, confirming the ambulance was on its way, the CEO finally looked at her directly. His eyes held a question, as if trying to understand why she cared so much. She didn't answer. She just gave him a small nod, silently promising she wasn't going to let him collapse without someone fighting for him. The room was quiet, except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. Minutes felt longer than they should. She kept her eyes on him, noticing how his breathing had changed. Slightly faster now, shallow. She resisted the urge to rush to his side and make him lie down, knowing that help was already on the way. When the distant sound of sirens began to echo through the street outside, relief and fear mixed inside her. She had done what she could. Now it was in the hands of professionals. But one thought repeated in her mind: if she had stayed silent even 10 minutes longer, the outcome could have been very different. She told him again that he needed a doctor immediately, but he shook his head, insisting he was fine and the meeting was more important. His voice carried that same forced calm, but she could see the truth in the way his fingers trembled slightly against the desk. She stepped closer, her tone firm yet careful, explaining that the weakness in his arm and the changes in his speech were warning signs. He looked at her as if she were overstepping, but she didn't back down. The assistant, who had been standing nearby, tried to move her aside. "We'll handle it," the assistant said, guiding her toward the door. But she stood her ground, her eyes locked on the CEO. She explained quickly and clearly that she had seen these symptoms before, that she knew exactly what could happen if he ignored them. Her voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that made everyone in the room pause. One of the senior managers walked in at that moment, holding a folder, ready to discuss numbers. He looked from the cleaner to the CEO, confused by the tension. "Is there a problem?" he asked. She didn't waste a second. "Yes, there is. He needs an ambulance. Now." The CEO frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "I don't need an ambulance," he said firmly. "I'm fine." But as he tried to rise from his chair to prove his point, his left leg hesitated and almost gave way beneath him. It was only for a moment, but it was enough. The manager's expression shifted from doubt to concern. "I think she's right," the manager said slowly, studying the CEO's face. "Let's just get a doctor to check you out." The CEO started to argue again, but his voice caught slightly, his words coming slower. The assistant, who had been watching closely now, glanced at the cleaner and gave a small nod, as if silently agreeing that this wasn't normal. The cleaner kept her focus on him. "If you wait, you might not be able to speak at all. You might not be able to move. Please, sir, I'm begging you. Let someone help." Her eyes didn't waver. She wasn't speaking out of fear for her job or to be noticed. She was speaking like someone who knew time was running out. For a long moment, the CEO stared at her, his pride fighting with the reality settling into his body. Then, with a frustrated sigh, he gestured to the assistant. "Fine. Call." The assistant immediately picked up the phone and began explaining the situation to emergency services. The cleaner stayed in place, watching him closely. She saw the way his breathing slowed after he sat back down, how his left hand stayed still in his lap, how his gaze drifted for a moment before refocusing. The manager stepped closer to the CEO's side, keeping a hand near him as if ready to steady him if he tried to stand again. In the hallway outside, people were starting to notice something was happening. Heads turned as whispers spread. The CEO looked at the cleaner again. There was no smile this time, only a faint look of confusion, maybe even respect. "How did you know?" he asked quietly. She swallowed and told him about her uncle, about how they had all ignored the same warning signs until it was almost too late. She said she couldn't stand by and watch that happen again. His eyes softened for a brief moment, but before he could say anything more, the assistant confirmed that an ambulance was on the way. The sound of activity outside the office grew louder. A few curious employees lingered near the doorway, but the manager firmly waved them away. The cleaner remained by the desk, not sitting, not moving far, ready to act if he suddenly got worse. He shifted slightly in his seat, looking frustrated at the disruption, but he didn't argue anymore. The tremor in his right hand became more noticeable, and when he tried to adjust his tie, his left hand made no effort to help. The assistant hung up the phone and came closer. "They said to keep you seated and calm until they arrive," she explained. He gave a short nod. The cleaner glanced at the clock. Every minute felt too long. She wanted to hear sirens already. Her eyes kept scanning him, face, hands, posture, memorizing every detail in case his condition changed. She had no medical training, but she knew enough to recognize that the situation was fragile. Finally, faint but distinct, the sound of sirens began to echo from outside the building. Relief washed over her, but she stayed alert. The CEO leaned back slightly, closing his eyes for a moment. She stepped closer, speaking gently. "They're almost here." When the sirens grew louder, the assistant moved to the door to guide the paramedics in. The cleaner remained by the desk until the uniformed team entered, their equipment ready. One of them immediately began speaking to the CEO, asking him to lift both arms to repeat a short sentence. He tried, but his left arm barely moved, and his words slurred more than before. The paramedics exchanged a quick look, confirming what she already knew. "We need to move now," one of them said. Within moments, they had him on his feet, supporting him firmly as they guided him toward the stretcher waiting outside the door. She stepped back, her hands still trembling slightly. The CEO glanced at her once more before leaving, and though his face was tense, his eyes held a silent acknowledgement. A thank you. He didn't yet have the strength to speak. Paramedics moved quickly, their voices calm but firm as they gave instructions to each other. One checked his pulse, another spoke into a radio, updating the hospital about his condition. The CEO tried to answer their questions, but his speech was slower now, his words not as clear. They asked him to squeeze their hands. His right hand responded, but his left stayed weak. They guided him out of the office, down the hallway, where curious employees peeked out from behind doors. Some whispered to each other, surprised to see their strong, always-in-control boss leaning on two strangers for support. The cleaner followed at a short distance, her eyes fixed on him. She wanted to make sure he got into that ambulance without collapsing along the way. In the lobby, the glass doors slid open, letting in a rush of street noise and cool air. The stretcher was already waiting. The paramedics helped him sit, then lie back. They strapped him in gently but firmly, checking his blood pressure and heart rate as they worked. He looked uncomfortable, not from pain, but from the unfamiliar feeling of not being in control. One of the paramedics asked who had first noticed the symptoms. The assistant hesitated, glancing at the cleaner. "She did," the assistant admitted, nodding toward her. The paramedic's eyes met hers, and he gave a small, appreciative nod. "Good catch," he said quietly. "Every minute counts with this." Hearing those words only made her more certain she had done the right thing. Still, she couldn't help wondering if they were already too late. She remembered her uncle's face in the hospital, the long days of recovery. She prayed silently that this man's story would end differently. As they wheeled him toward the ambulance, the CEO's gaze shifted toward her. His eyes lingered for a second, and though he didn't speak, she could see a flicker of recognition, an unspoken acknowledgement that her insistence had brought him to this point, alive and with a chance. The paramedics lifted the stretcher into the ambulance, locking it in place. One climbed inside to monitor his vitals, while another stayed by the open door, taking quick notes. The assistant stood nearby, speaking urgently into the phone, likely calling the hospital to arrange everything ahead of time. She stayed a few steps back, not wanting to be in the way, but unable to leave. The siren was still silent, waiting until they pulled into the street, but the lights on the roof were flashing, casting blue and red reflections on the building's glass walls. Before they closed the doors, the paramedic inside leaned out and asked if anyone would be riding with him. The assistant said she would go, climbing in and taking a seat beside the CEO. The manager, who had been in the office earlier, promised to follow by car. The cleaner stood on the sidewalk, watching as they prepared to leave. She could see the CEO lying there, his head turned slightly toward the door, eyes half closed but still alert. For a brief moment, their eyes met again. It wasn't the look of a man who felt defeated. It was the look of someone who understood that help had come at the exact moment it was needed. The back doors shut with a solid click. The paramedic in the driver's seat started the engine, and the siren came alive, loud and urgent. People on the street stepped aside, watching as the ambulance pulled into traffic. She stood there until it disappeared around the corner, the sound of the siren fading into the distance. Only then did she realize her hands were trembling. The adrenaline that had kept her focused was beginning to fade, replaced by a strange mix of relief and worry. When she walked back inside, the lobby felt strangely quiet. The security guard, who had been distracted earlier, gave her a curious look, as if finally realizing something serious had happened. The other employees moved about in hushed tones, glancing toward her, but not speaking. She returned to her cleaning cart, moving it slowly toward the service area. Every corner of the building looked the same as it had an hour ago, yet everything felt different now. She had interrupted the flow of a normal workday, and for once, people had noticed her, not for her job, but for something far more important. In her mind, she replayed the chain of events. If she had ignored the tremor in his hand that morning, if she had brushed off the slurred words, if she had believed it wasn't her place to speak, he might still be sitting in that office, getting worse with every passing minute. The thought sent a chill through her. A little while later, the assistant returned briefly to gather some documents. She walked over to the cleaner and said quietly, "The doctors said it was a good thing we called when we did. It could have been much worse." There was genuine gratitude in her voice, and for the first time since she started working there, she addressed the cleaner by name. The cleaner nodded, not trusting herself to speak without her voice shaking. She simply said, "I hope he'll be okay," and went back to her work. For the rest of the afternoon, she moved through the building with her usual routine, but her thoughts stayed with the man now lying in a hospital bed. She knew she had done all she could. Now it was up to the doctors. 2 days later, her phone rang while she was in the middle of mopping the quiet hallway on the top floor. It was the CEO's assistant. Her voice sounded lighter than before, almost relieved. She told the cleaner that the CEO wanted to see her. At first, she thought she had misheard. No one at that level usually called for her unless there was a special cleaning request. But the assistant explained that the doctors had confirmed it had been a stroke in progress, and the quick response had saved his life. Without it, he could have died or been left with permanent damage. Her heart began to race. She put away the mop and wiped her hands on her apron before taking the elevator down to the lobby, where the assistant was waiting to drive her to the hospital. The ride felt strange. This was not a place she ever thought she'd be going for a reason like this. She kept replaying the events in her mind, wondering if she would see him weak or recovering, and what she would say when she did. When they arrived, the hospital's smell of antiseptic and faint medicine greeted her. The assistant led her down a quiet corridor to a private room. She stepped inside slowly, her eyes landing on the CEO. He was sitting up in bed, a blanket over his legs, dressed in a plain hospital gown instead of his usual expensive suit. His hair was slightly messy, and there were faint dark circles under his eyes, but his color was better, and his expression brighter than the last time she had seen him. He turned his head toward her, and for a moment there was silence. Then he gave a small smile, one that reached both sides of his face this time. "You," he said softly, his voice still carrying a slight rasp, "are the reason I'm here talking to you today." She shook her head quickly. "I just noticed," she replied, her voice unsure. "You noticed what no one else did," he said firmly, his gaze holding hers. "Everyone else was too busy, too distracted, or too afraid to say something. But you didn't stop." She felt her throat tighten. She didn't know how to respond to praise from a man like him. He was someone who commanded rooms full of powerful people, and now he was speaking to her as if she were the most important person in his day. He reached for the water glass on his bedside table, his movements steadier now. "The doctors told me minutes made the difference. You gave me those minutes. That's not something I can ever forget." The assistant, standing near the door, added, "The hospital staff said if you had waited even half an hour more, things could have been much worse." The cleaner nodded slowly, still processing their words. She thought of how close she had come to saying nothing, how easily she could have walked past him like everyone else. The weight of that choice settled heavily in her chest, but in a good way, a reminder that sometimes doing the uncomfortable thing was the only right choice. The CEO leaned back against his pillows, a thoughtful expression on his face. "I've been surrounded by people my whole life," he said, "but it took someone invisible to everyone else to actually see me." She felt her cheeks warm at his words. She had never thought of herself as brave, only as someone who paid attention. But in that moment, she realized that paying attention could be a form of bravery, too. They spoke for a little while longer. He asked her about her family, her life, how long she had been working in the building. She answered politely, still feeling out of place in the quiet, expensive hospital room. But his tone was warm, and he listened carefully to every word she said. Before she left, he said, "When I'm out of here, I want to talk about your future. I don't want someone like you to go unnoticed in my company again." His words startled her, and she didn't quite know what he meant, but there was sincerity in his voice. She stood there for a moment, unsure whether to thank him or simply nod. In the end, she gave a small smile and said, "Just get better. That's what matters now." As she walked out of the room, her footsteps quiet in the hospital corridor, she felt a strange mixture of relief and disbelief. 2 days ago, she had been afraid he might not survive the ambulance ride. Now he was sitting up, speaking, even making plans. The assistant escorted her back to the car. On the ride to the office, she stared out the window, the city moving past in a blur. Everything looked the same, the traffic, the people rushing on the sidewalks, the tall buildings. But for her, something had shifted. She had always thought of herself as just another worker, someone unnoticed in the background. But now she knew her actions had changed the course of another person's life, someone who, by all appearances, had everything. When they reached the office, she went back to her usual tasks, but the day felt different. The whispers she had noticed before were now replaced by respectful glances. A few people even stopped to ask how the CEO was doing. She answered briefly, not giving details, but each time she spoke, she felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had done something no one else had dared to do. The story spread through the company faster than she expected. By the end of the week, everyone knew that the cleaner had been the one to spot the CEO's symptoms before anyone else. People who had never spoken to her before were now stopping in the hall to smile or greet her. Some thanked her directly, saying they had heard she had saved his life. Others looked at her with a new kind of respect, no longer just passing by as if she were invisible. One morning, the CEO returned to the building. He wasn't fully back to work yet. His doctors had told him to take it slow, but he wanted to see everyone and thank the staff for their support. He walked into the lobby, not in his usual rushed way, but steady and calm, dressed in a simple suit. The assistant walked beside him, carrying a light briefcase. She was in the lobby that morning, polishing the glass table near the reception. She looked up and saw him approach. His face lit up when he saw her, and he walked straight toward her. "Good to see you again," he said warmly, "and thank you, again." She smiled politely, unsure what to say in front of the others who were watching. "I'm just glad you're okay," she replied quietly. The CEO gestured for her to follow him. They walked a few steps away from the others, and he lowered his voice. "I meant what I said in the hospital. I don't want your skills to go unnoticed. You didn't just save me, you showed courage, judgment, and care. Those are rare qualities." She shook her head slightly, feeling shy under his praise. "I just paid attention," she said. "That's exactly the point," he replied. "In a world where most people don't look past their own concerns, you paid attention, you acted, and that made all the difference." Later that day, the company held a small gathering in the conference room. The CEO stood at the front, speaking to the staff. He talked about how grateful he was for their work during his recovery, and then he spoke about her. He told the room how she had noticed what everyone else had missed, how she had insisted on action when it would have been easier to stay silent. People turned to look at her, some nodding, others smiling. When the CEO finished, he announced that she would be given a special recognition award and a bonus. The applause that followed felt unreal to her. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, but in that moment, she understood that what she had done mattered more than she had allowed herself to believe. In the weeks that followed, her job remained the same in many ways. She still cleaned the offices, polished the windows, and emptied the bins, but her place in the company felt different. Managers who once walked past without a glance now greeted her by name. People asked her opinion on small matters, treating her as part of the team rather than just the background. One afternoon, the CEO called her into his office. He was looking stronger, his voice steady and his posture straight. "I wanted to ask if you'd consider another role here," he said. "Something that takes advantage of your attention to detail and your ability to speak up when it matters." He explained that there was a position in the health and safety department where her skills could help prevent risks before they became serious problems. She hesitated at first, unsure if she was qualified, but he assured her that the company would provide training and support. "You've already proven you have the most important quality," he said. "You care enough to act." After a few days of thinking it over, she accepted. Her duties changed gradually. Less cleaning, more checking work areas for hazards, making sure emergency procedures were followed, and even giving short talks to staff about recognizing warning signs of health issues. The change was strange at first. She missed the quiet routine of her old job, but she also felt proud to be trusted with new responsibilities. Every time she passed the CEO's office and saw him working, healthy and focused, she remembered that day and how close things had come to being very different. Months later, during a staff meeting, the CEO spoke again about the importance of looking out for one another. He mentioned her name once more, using her story as an example. "It's not just about doing your job," he told everyone. "It's about noticing, caring, and acting. That's what keeps us all moving forward." She sat in the back of the room, listening quietly, a small smile on her face. She hadn't set out to be noticed. She had only wanted to make sure someone got help when they needed it. But that single choice had changed not just his life, but her own. And though she still thought of herself as the same person she had been before that day, she now understood something important: that sometimes the smallest actions can leave the biggest mark, and the people who seem invisible can be the ones who make all the difference.